Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ingo Zechner. On behalf of the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies, I'd like to welcome you tonight to this very special lecture, which is part of a series of Simon Wiesenthal lectures we started in 2007. The Jewish Museum Vienna is one of 7 founding members of the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute, which is going to start its provisional office operations in January 2009. Immediately after the 100th birthday anniversary of Simon Wiesenthal. I'd like to thank Director Haber and Director Weinberger of the museum, and also the museum staff for their hospitality. Most of those who lost family members in the Shoah, and most of the organizations providing information and support to survivors and to the offspring of the victims, at a certain point had to deal with the very institution you're going to hear about tonight. The archive of the International Tracing Service of the Red Cross in Bad Arolsen contains over 50 million World War II documents relating to the fates of over 17.5 million people. This archive has been organized and used from the perspective of the search for individual persons. At the same time, it has been a kind of hidden treasure of information on what exactly happened in the camps. Tonight's speaker is the man behind and on top of the campaign that led to the opening of the ITS archive. Being director of the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., he holds one of the most prominent positions in the field of Holocaust research. The Jewish Community Vienna and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum have developed a very strong cooperation over the past years since 2002 by jointly reconstructing the archive of the Jewish Community Vienna. This was possible thanks to the commitment of so many people in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and thanks to the very strong personal support of the man I'm going to introduce to you, who is also a very dear friend. Welcome, please welcome with me Paul Shapiro.
Good evening. I want to thank Ingo Zechner for these warm, welcoming words and tell you that indeed that friendship and appreciation is absolutely mutual. I'd like to thank the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies for inviting me to deliver this Simon Wiesenthal lecture. In the 1970s, Simon Wiesenthal and I collaborated at long distance in uncovering documentation that led to the removal of citizenship and the deportation from the United States of the first fascist leader against whom the American Justice Department took such action. You may not remember who that was, but I'll remind you a little bit later. I can't express my admiration for that man, whose name this lecture series carries. I'm truly honored to have been asked and consider it a great privilege to deliver this evening's lecture in the 100th anniversary year of Simon Wiesenthal's birth. Before I talk about ITS, I'd like to show you a short video that was broadcast on American television in December of 2006. It's actually a piece of a longer story. Was broadcast on the 60 Minutes television program, the most influential news television program in our country for the last 40 years.
You're about to see for the first time secrets of the Nazi Holocaust that have been hidden away for more than 60 years. We're not talking about a missing filing cabinet. We're talking about thousands of filing cabinets holding 50 million pages. It's Hitler's secret archive. The Nazis were famous for record keeping, but what we found ran from the bizarre to the horrifying. This Holocaust history was discovered by the Allies in dozens of concentration camps as Germany fell in the spring of 1945. The documents were taken to a town in the middle of Germany called Bad Arolsen, where they were sorted, filed, and locked away, never to be seen by the public until now.
The storerooms are immense, 16 miles of shelves holding the stories of 17 million victims, not only Jews, but slave laborers, political prisoners, and homosexuals. To open the files is to see the Holocaust staring back like it was yesterday. Strange pink Gestapo arrest warrants as lethal as a death sentence. Jewelry lost as freedom ended at the gates of an extermination camp. Time stopped here in 1945. We walked through the evidence with Chief Archivist Udo Joost. He showed us this list of 1,000 prisoners saved by a factory owner who told the Nazis he needed the prisoners' labor. This is Oskar Schindler's list, made famous by the Steven Spielberg movie.
Here are the 700 men and the 300 women whose names were on Schindler's list.
Esther Friedman, Rosa Friedrich, Raina Ferber, the people of Schindler's List.
We also found the file of Frank, Anneliese Marie, better known as Anne Frank. It's her paper trail from Amsterdam to Bergen-Belsen, where she died at the age of 15. But most of the names here are unknown. Totenboek means death book, and just look at the names of the executed, crowded onto pages, single-spaced. It must have been tiring just to write this, let alone kill them all.
Here we see the cause of death, executed, and you can see every 2 minutes they shot one prisoner.
So they shot a prisoner every 2 minutes for a little over an hour and a half.
Yes, now look at the date. It's the 20th of April. That was Adolf Hitler's birthday. And this was a birthday present, a gift for the Führer. That's the bureaucracy of the devil.
The devil is in the details, the smallest details. We were amazed to see that the Nazis were keeping records of head lice.
Lice control.
You can see the names and numbers of each prisoner and the amount of lice that were found.
The Nazis couldn't have disease spreading among slave laborers.
You can see he was a perfectionist. He even put down the size of the lice. Large, small, or medium-sized lice.
Paul Shapiro helped pry open the archive. He's director of Holocaust Studies at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum.
I'm curious, why did the Nazis keep all these records? If they were going to murder these people anyway, why keep paperwork?
Because they wanted to show they were getting the job done. So in terms of people whose destiny was to be murdered, recording how well that was being done was very important.
And those records make up the largest Holocaust archive anywhere. Run by the Red Cross, the International Tracing Service, as it's known, was set up after the war to trace lost family members. Survivors could write for information, but there was a backlog of 400,000 unanswered letters, and neither survivors nor scholars got past the lobby.
What was the stated reason for keeping these documents out of the public eye for more than 60 years?
So a respect for the privacy of individuals was the most often cited reason. On the one hand, you had governments stating we're protecting people's privacy. And on the other hand, you had those very people saying, no, we want the material to be open.
When Germany, last spring, became the last of 11 countries to agree, they began the process of opening the archive. It'll take about a year. But we brought these men to Bad Arolsen for an advanced look. Walter Fiden, Mickey Schwartz, and Jack Rosenthal are the first Holocaust survivors ever in the archive. Schwartz of San Diego was 14 when he watched his parents herded to the gas chambers at Auschwitz, and then later was forced to sign himself in at Buchenwald.
Can I touch it?
Please, yes, absolutely. In a sense, it's yours.
Thank you. It's Nicholas Schwartz. That's my writing.
We asked the Red Cross to find all the documents for our 3 survivors. There were plenty of surprises, including a mysterious reprieve.
This is a transport list for prisoners leaving Buchenwald and going to a camp called Dora.
Yes.
Do you know what Dora was?
Yes. Some sort of fabrication of armament.
The arms fabricated at Dora were the V-1 and V-2 rockets that rained on London.
And the story of that place is hardly anybody got out of there alive. Look at your name. It's on the transport list to go there. And somebody's drawn a line straight in the middle of it. They took you off the list. Did you know until this moment that you were headed to Dora?
No. Never. Never, never, never. Wow.
Schwartz had no idea why he was taken off the list. Of 50 people on the page, he was one of only 2 with a lifeline straight through his name.
I'm sort of, yes, I'm shaking, I'm scared right now.
Looking at that paper makes you scared right now.
Right now it makes me think back, and I'm living like there is this 14-year-old youngster and they wanted to kill him. I don't know why. I did not ever do any harm to anybody. I think I should have a middle name. My middle name to be Mr. Lucky.
Are you glad you looked back at the documents?
Definitely. I feel like I learned about me, at least what happened. And specifically what I'm glad about, for those people who said the Holocaust didn't happen, like the president of Iran. If they have any question about it, please come to Bad Arolsen and check it out for themselves.
Now, before I begin my main subject, and in memory of Simon Wiesenthal, I'd like to show you a few documents from the International Tracing Service. We'll also test my technical ability here. Okay. So this is a card from what is known as the Central Name Index at Bad Arolsen. And it's a notation. You can see Simon Wiesenthal's name, although it's spelled a little differently than we're used to. His prisoner number from Mauthausen. There's an indication that he was in Gross Rosen, but no prisoner number. And you can see there's a reference on the right-hand side to a list of prisoners at Gross Rosen, sorry. And here you can't see it, but I know where it is, and I can actually point to it. Prisoner 91, which is just here, is Simon Wiesenthal, December 31st, 1908, his birth date, and his prisoner number. This is from another file there. It's actually a record of the ghettos, labor camps, prison, concentration camps, where Simon Wiesenthal spent and survived the Holocaust. Here's a similar card for his wife, Silla Wiesenthal. You can tell just by putting these two cards together when they were separated. They were arrested the same day and sent to the ghetto in Lvov. They were separated just a few weeks later when Simon Wiesenthal was taken out of the ghetto and that was their moment of separation. Just another document to illustrate the kind of material that's there. This is a displaced person's registration card. It was filled out by Silla Wiesenthal. You can see her signature here at the bottom. It's filled out just a month after the end of the war. And you can just note that at the time, in the immediate aftermath of the war, she wanted to go to Palestine or the United States. So it's just in memory of these two people that were so significant for all of us, I wanted to show these few documents. Now, if you'll permit me, I'm going to speak for a while and then come back to that video that we saw. The full video actually is still viewable on the 60 Minutes website online if you're interested. One of those three survivors, Walter Feiden, was actually a native of Vienna, and his story is also quite remarkable. And you can learn something about that if you look at the entire video. Now, beyond what I do professionally, I want to tell you something else about myself that may explain why I'm involved in this and why I'm here. My father's father, Louis, came to the United States in 1905 from the Pale of Settlement in Russia. My grandmother, whose maiden name was Mary Berman, and their two children, came with him. Family name was changed from Sheikhet to Shapiro when they arrived in the United States. And these people were the only members of their families who left Russia. My mother's father's family was a Sephardic family, part of the wave of Sephardim that took refuge after 1492 in the Ottoman Empire and then made their way north, finally settling in Galicia. Simcha Cartagena, my great-grandfather, left for America in 1900 and brought over his 5 children one by one, as he could afford to do it. No other Cartageners left Europe. My grandfather, Isidore Cartagena, married a woman named Tilly Stanger, also one of 5 children in the only part of her family that left Poland. My grandmother never learned to read or write. My mother used to write letters for her to the family that stayed behind until the Shoah. So the Sheikhets, the Bermans, the Cartageners, and the Stangers, all of them, except those few people who came to America, were murdered. The names of a few Cartageners appear in Auschwitz labor records, but most of those families, to the best of my knowledge, remain unidentified and their names unrecorded. Which brings me to the archives of the International Tracing Service, or ITS. I'll simply say ITS from here on. More than 50 million pages of original documentation relating to 17.5 million people who were victimized by the Nazis, including perhaps some Sheikhets, some Bermans, some Cartageners, and some Stangers. Until the end of 2007, so just a year ago, ITS was the largest collection of inaccessible records anywhere that shed light on the fates of people from across Europe, Jews, of course, and members of every other nationality as well, who were arrested, deported, sent to concentration camps, and even murdered by the Nazis, who were put to forced and slave labor under conditions that were often calculated to result in their deaths, or who were displaced from their homes and families and unable to return home at the end of the war. These were documents that Allied forces collected as they liberated camps and forced labor sites across Europe in the last months of the war and during their post-war occupation and administration of Germany and Austria. They include also the records of displaced persons camps run by the Allies and records assembled by UNRWA and the International Refugee Organization after the war, additional thousands of collections continue to be deposited at ITS by governments, organizations, and even some individuals right up to 2006. Sometimes governments placed documents in Bad Arolsen because they knew that no one would ever see them. Now, why in Bad Arolsen, you might ask? Arolsen was in a region of Germany that was liberated early, and the town had not been heavily bombed. But there's also a Holocaust connection. Arolsen housed an extensive SS training facility, thanks to the influence of SS Obergruppenführer Josias, Prince of Waldeck, who was responsible for the Weimar region of the Third Reich, and whose family's ancestral residence was, and still is, in the town. As Allied forces approached, of course, the SS barracks were empty and available, and an appropriate place to store the documents. It's unlikely that the people who assembled those records in the aftermath of World War II, collecting them from camps and Gestapo offices and prisons, labor sites, could have imagined that 6 decades later, what grew to be a collection of over 50 million documents would still be hidden away in Bad Arolsen and would still be inaccessible to survivors and to scholars. And who would believe that 11 generally enlightened democratic governments, including the government of the United States and the government of Israel, whether intentionally or not, but definitely placing a higher value on diplomatic consensus than on human compassion, would be responsible for keeping this documentation closed. And who would believe that those governments and the International Committee of the Red Cross, and from now on I'm just going to say Red Cross, appeared ready 60 years later to see the last remnant of the Holocaust survivor generation disappear without giving them access to their records and information about their families, and without providing them with the comfort of knowing that the documentary record of what happened to them and to the people that they lost would not be conveniently kept under wraps, swept under the rug, as one survivor said to me, once the survivors were gone. At first blush, of course, no one in this room would believe any of that, and yet that was the situation. This evening, I want to provide you with a glimpse into the political struggle that was involved in opening ITS. I also have to say it's too early to tell the whole story. And then describe the ITS collections and show you some samples. I want to provide a quick status report regarding the digital copying of the archives, the transfer of copies to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and the scholarly and educational material, the scholarly and educational potential of the material. I'll then close with some thoughts on the multiple layers of significance of these documents. So the struggle to open ITS. I first attended a meeting of the 11-country International Commission of ITS that sets policy in Paris in May 2001 to see if I could mobilize the Commission to honor a promise that it had made 3 years earlier to open the archives. I had no idea then what would be involved. Yes, the documentation in the archives was huge, but it was 50 or 60 years old. And surely the Red Cross and the 11 governments would understand the urgency of the matter. The timetable for the project, I kept insisting, could not be a leisurely diplomatic timetable, nor could it be an archivist timetable. The real timetable was the actuarial table of a survivor generation that tragically was already disappearing before us. The International Commission was locked in debate about possible access guidelines that had been drafted, debated, thrown out, redrafted, and debated again for 3 years. The guidelines were upsetting, to say the least. This was what they were. Advanced application to visit the archive would be required, with no time limit set for receiving a response. No access would be granted if ITS determined that the person didn't need to see the records. No access would be given to finding aids. The researcher would pay all staff costs associated with any assistance he or she might receive, and assistance would be available only when the staff was not otherwise busy. All information in the documents that related to persons, places, or dates would be blacked out before the researcher could see anything. Each researcher would be required to purchase liability insurance for ITS, for the Red Cross, and for the 11 governments, just in case the researcher misused the records and got sued. Such regulations, of course, were likely to ensure, and I think were calculated to ensure, that no one would actually apply to see these records or gain access to them. In addition, the countries were locked in a controversy over whose privacy and archival laws and practices would apply. Countries reluctant to open the archives, and that was certainly the majority, together with ITS leadership and the Red Cross, proposed privacy regulations that included the most restrictive conditions that appeared in any of the regulations of any of the countries. That is, they wanted the most restrictive common denominator. By the end of that meeting, it was clear to me that nothing would be decided in 2001. In spite of the urgency that I had tried to communicate, the Commission did not plan any further discussion for a full year until its next annual meeting, scheduled for a single day in May 2002 in Berlin. I visited ITS together with the only person in the American State Department who was willing to listen when I insisted that as a member state of the International Commission, we had a right to get past the front door and see the documents. I was overwhelmed during that visit by 6 buildings full of the documentation of transports, deportations, concentration camps, Gestapo offices, forced and slave labor sites, burial records, displaced person camp records, resettlement files, and other documentation relating to millions of innocent victims of the Nazis and their allies. Not only were these archives sealed shut, but there was a backlog of 450,000 requests for information from survivors and their families. Some of the requests were 10 years old, with no evident sense of urgency to respond. That visit was a powerful experience, and I knew then that for me anyway, there could be no turning away from the issue or turning back. But what could be done? I thought that the governments needed to have a clear idea of what was in the archives if they were going to be moved to act, as I had been moved by my one-day visit to Bad Arolsen. For diplomats who thought about ITS just one day a year and who served on the International Commission for just a year or two, in the absence of reliable information, the safest course was always going to be to do nothing. My request for information regarding the collections met a stone wall. It's quite amazing, actually. My suggestion to bring in professional archivists and historians to help was also refused. I soon came to understand that the denial of information regarding the contents of the archive was part of a carefully devised strategy to prevent action. At the May 2002 meeting of the International Commission in Berlin, the chair, it was Germany that year, and the ITS director made it clear that information about the collections was restricted and that my request was inappropriate. Information would be shared only on the basis of a unanimous request by all the Commission countries, and the chair assured me, before cutting off discussion and adjourning the meeting, that unanimity would not be achieved because the chair itself, Germany, was opposed. The other countries on the International Commission were reluctant to press this issue. Some were simply uninterested, and some had been led behind the scenes to believe that if they supported the request for a list of collections, ITS would further slow down the already tremendously backlogged flow of information to survivors in their countries. And this in the midst of the processing or failure to process claims under what were then recent slave labor settlements. When I asked which countries had enough information to describe the collections to the others, no one responded. When I asked which countries wanted more information, the response again was silence. I wasn't permitted to ask a third question. When I told one German foreign ministry official after the meeting that this issue was not going to go away, he warned me that Germany would delay action for years by using the issue of privacy to stimulate conflicts of legal interpretation among the lawyers of the Commission members. Still, I hope that providing a clear sense of the archive's powerful contents would convince the governments and the Red Cross that they had a moral obligation to act, and to act sooner rather than later. This approach, which was logical in my view, regrettably didn't produce results, at least not in the International Commission. The ITS director and the Red Cross maintained right until the end that no list of ITS archival collections had ever been assembled. Something we were to learn later was simply a lie. And the State Department, my State Department, out of deference to diplomatic nicety and not anxious to add another problem to what in those days were already troubled relations with our European allies, for a long time would not agree even to ask officially on behalf of the United States for information about the ITS collections. Assembling information about the contents of the archive thus required a big research effort. Fortunately, my staff in Washington, it's a great staff, was up to that challenge. We located a 4-volume inventory produced by the Allied High Commission for Germany in 1955, when it turned the records already assembled in Arolsen over to the Red Cross. And they located lists of many of the collections that had been deposited at Bad Arolsen for 50 years after 1955 by governments, organizations, and even private individuals. Nevertheless, the stalemate persisted. The International Commission met for half a day in Athens in May 2003 and adjourned, leaving the next discussion for the following year. I spent much of that year pressing for a more aggressive American diplomatic stance. I was accused on more than one occasion of wanting to toss a bomb onto the negotiating table. Sadly, when the State Department prepared for the meeting of the International Commission scheduled for Jerusalem in May 2004, so 3 years have already gone by, the State Department approach was to hope that someone else would raise this issue. The department's instructions for Jerusalem were issued the same weekend that the United States dedicated a new World War II memorial in Washington. I sent a not very diplomatic message to the Office of the Ambassador for Holocaust Affairs in the State Department, expressing my judgment that the American failure to act decisively regarding ITS was, and this is just a small piece, and I would say a cleaned up piece, that our failure to act was cementing the place of our own country as part of the problem rather than part of the solution. In the face of a dying generation of World War II veterans, I wrote, the United States has opened the earth and is dedicating a granite monument this weekend. In the face of a dying generation of Holocaust survivors who suffered the full fury of the Nazis and their allies, we are unable to express a bold and compassionate idea to lay open a pile of paper that tells their story. No one will understand our willingness to accept the status quo. We would not accept our own inaction from others. This will not be a chapter of Holocaust history that we will be proud to teach to future generations of Americans. Needless to say, I was not the most popular person in Washington the following week. Nevertheless, by this time I had enlisted the support of organizations that I was sure would carry some influence with the International Commission. The president of the American Gathering of Jewish Holocaust Survivors, Ben Mead, some of you may have met Ben Mead, a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto, wrote a strongly worded letter to the ITS International Commission demanding open access. "What's the matter with them? Have they no heart?" he said to me. The president of the German Studies Association of the United States at that time, Henry Friedlander, a child survivor of the Lodz Ghetto, also wrote, criticizing the Commission for planning an access regime, these are his words, so restrictive that in effect the Commission is serving notice that its intention is to block rather than to provide access. Neither president, neither of these survivors, ever received a response. Tragically, Ben Mead, like the vast majority of the survivor generation he represented, passed away before he could witness the actual opening of the archives. Now, looking for an international audience that might share my concern, I raised the Bad Arolsen issue with the then 20-member country International Task Force for Holocaust Education, Remembrance, and Research, which met in Washington in December of 2003. The task force, by the way, just completed its annual meetings here in Vienna under Austrian chairmanship for the first time. My raising the topic was labeled, and I got used to the word, inappropriate by the American chair, our ambassador for Holocaust issues. I actually began to think that inappropriate might be my middle name. But the task force's executive secretary was open to the idea of my doing a briefing at the next task force meeting in Rome in June 2004. This was an opportunity, I thought, to place the matter before a large group of people, including archivists, scholars, and educators, who were committed to addressing Holocaust issues. Moreover, 9 of the 11 countries on the International Commission of ITS were members of the task force. They were formally committed, their governments were formally committed as members of the task force through the Stockholm Declaration of 2000 to the principle of open access to Holocaust-related archives. Could they be committed to open access as members of the task force and continue to obstruct access in the ITS International Commission? This, I thought, was an angle worth pursuing. I prepared a white paper for the Rome meeting of the task force, and as you can see here, this is just the heading of it, I addressed what I saw as the key issues and key obstacles to effective action regarding the archives. I described the contents of the archives based on the information my staff had assembled at the museum. I addressed the systematic evasion of responsibility for decision-making that was made possible by the complex set of relationships among the International Commission, the German Ministry of the Interior, which funded ITS, ITS's on-site leadership, and the Red Cross. Now, what do I mean by that? If you had an issue that you wanted to raise and you went to the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva, they would say, we just administer this archive, go and talk to the International Commission. And if you went to talk to the International Commission, they would say, we make big policy and frankly, we don't know much about it. You should probably go and talk to the German Interior Ministry because they fund the activities under a post-war treaty. And they'll know better what's happening there. And if you went and talked to the German Ministry of the Interior, they would say, we only provide the money. Go and talk to the director on site of ITS. And if you went and talked to the director on site of ITS, he would say, I'm only an administrator. If you want a policy decision, go and talk to the International Commission, and you just went around and around and around. In this white paper, I revealed for the first time publicly the massive backlog, 450,000 unanswered inquiries, that existed in responding to requests from aging survivors, and the inaccurate responses that survivors often received if they got a response. I proposed a set of concrete actions as well. The American ambassador for Holocaust issues at the task force meeting disavowed this white paper because it had not been cleared in advance. I asked him if he would have cleared it. He said no, and I told him that was fine. But the meeting participants picked up 150 copies of this paper on the first day of the meetings, and more on the second day. And by the final day, a unanimous resolution was passed by the task force calling for the immediate opening of the archives. The International Commission of ITS, and I know it's a bureaucratic seesaw here, met in Jerusalem just a few days before this task force meeting. They sought to preempt task force action by issuing a press release promising to open the ITS archives by the end of that year, 2004. But predictably, no action followed that. Some task force members organized a group visit to Bad Arolsen. They experienced firsthand the closed-door, share-no-information policy of that time. And as a result, I gained some allies. When representatives of the Red Cross and the ITS director were invited to the next meeting of the task force in December 2004, they appeared, but refused to answer any questions about the content of the archives or the access issue. A second task force resolution was issued that day and released to the press, and then a third a few months later. I could feel the balance finally beginning to shift and decided to increase the pressure a little. With my encouragement, on May 9, 2005, now remember, we've gone through 4 years here already, just before the 2005 meeting of the ITS Commission, a synagogue colleague of mine, who's also a former investigative reporter for United Press International, published an article in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune entitled "Pressure Mounts to Open Holocaust Records." His article included comments by Elie Wiesel and other outraged Holocaust survivors. The article appeared in the McClatchy News Service. You may never have heard of this. So it was not exactly the New York Times, but the article did appear online also and was reported on abroad. Now, this was not devastating media exposure. It was more like a distant bark to indicate to the International Commission that there might actually be a dog that bites somewhere ahead. On May 19th, Die Zeit, one of Germany's most influential newspapers, as you know, published a full-page article by a man named Frank-Uwe Betz, with whom I had been corresponding. His article was entitled "The Other Memorial," das andere Mahnmal. Betz blasted ITS as an anachronism, a bureaucratic dinosaur, and identified the ITS archives with its 17.5 million victim names as a Holocaust memorial that was at least as important as the, this is his word, anonymous memorial that was about to be dedicated in the heart of Berlin to the memory of Europe's murdered Jews. My hope, of course, was to signal that the new Berlin Memorial, in which the German government had invested so heavily, both financially and symbolically, might open in the middle of a controversy. Die Zeit reinforced Betz's article with a lead editorial that labeled the International Commission's failure to act an enduring scandal. This was very undiplomatic, but the effect could be seen almost immediately. 2 weeks later, the International Commission of ITS met in Rome under Italian chairmanship. The members complained bitterly about the fact that the Commission's business was being subjected to public scrutiny. But there was also a growing realization that the issue of the ITS archives was not going to go away. Vehement, irritated discussion, almost shouting sometime, punctuated by unscheduled recesses to allow tempers to cool, focused on recognition that the Commission would have to announce something. But what? After all, it had promised the year before to take action and done nothing. So empty promises were unlikely to buy more time. 3 countries, Germany, Italy, and Belgium, supported by the Red Cross and the director of ITS, insisted that no decision could be taken without unanimity, and they made it clear that they would not join what seemed to be an emerging, although reluctant, majority view that it was time to do something. My proposal to the American delegation, and I did not go to this meeting, it would have been too explosive, to seek agreement to make digital copies of the ITS records available at other research sites was rejected by the American delegation as too hot to handle. Even a suggestion to create a committee of specialists to provide expert guidance generated controversy. The chair refused to call a vote on the creation of an experts committee and announced that he would not consider a majority decision legitimate. But some delegates became angered by this attempt of a shrinking minority to abuse the consensus principle to dictate inaction. When one delegate alleged that deciding anything by majority vote would violate the principles of democracy, the representative of Greece on the Commission stepped in to remind the group, flamboyantly, from democracy's birthplace, that voting stood at the very heart of democracy. The chair tried to adjourn the meeting until the following year before a vote could be taken, but was unsuccessful. The majority then voted to establish an experts working group. While the chair continued to assert that the vote was illegitimate, France offered to chair the illegitimate working group. The director of ITS and the Red Cross liaison for ITS refused to cooperate with the new group, but the die was cast. It was not easy to make real progress. At first, it was necessary to beat back heavy-handed efforts to derail the working group from its real work. Could I really want it to be revealed publicly that someone's grandfather was a homosexual? I was asked. I responded by asking whether the question was not itself an indication of a continuation of the homophobia that had characterized the Nazi regime. Could I really want it to be known that Jews, and I use the word that was used, collaborated, that some Jews collaborated with the Nazis in camps and ghettos? I responded by pointing out that it was well known that Jews were placed in impossible situations by their murderers, and sometimes committed acts to attempt to save their own lives, which we, in hindsight, with the luxury of not being there, might question, but that there was no question about who the real perpetrators were during the Shoah, and that any effort to transform the victims into perpetrators represented, in my view, a tendency toward Holocaust denial. What right did anyone but Germany have to the documents, I was asked. Their original provenance was German, and provenance usually determines ownership in the archival world. I responded that insofar as I had been able to determine, at least half of the documents in ITS were of Allied provenance, dating from the immediate post-war period and the displaced persons period. And secondly, that there was a historical reason that the documents were not German property, since they were captured following the defeat of the country of provenance after it had unleashed a genocidal war of aggression. I said a few other things too. I won't repeat them here. I was chastised that day for being so inappropriate. Yes, my middle name again. But progress followed. Between June of 2005 and May of 2006, it became possible to clear away obstacle after obstacle. This involved a lot of meetings, often tension-filled face-to-face meetings. The approach of the State Department was finally changed thanks to the direct influence of then Assistant Secretary of State Nicholas Burns, whose wife, it turns out, had family affected by the Holocaust. Under pressure, the ITS director finally distributed some poorly organized information about the contents of the archives. But he kept hidden until the day he was fired the fact that ITS had maintained a full list of the collections that were there. Recognizing that Bad Arolsen was a hard place to get to, and to ensure open access with no risk of reversal if a government changed its mind, I pressed again for agreement to distribute copies of the entire contents of the archives to major research centers and other locations. And after difficult negotiation, that was actually approved, although with the limitation to locations in the member states of the International Commission. This didn't mean that all opposition faded away. Simultaneously with the meetings of the Experts Commission, an editorial appeared on the ITS website that labeled the push to open the archives as legally and morally unjustifiable. So clearly more convincing was necessary. I worked with a German documentary filmmaker who prepared a 15-minute segment about ITS that was broadcast on Germany's 60 Minutes equivalent, if I could say it that way, a program called Titel, Thesen, Temperamente. And that aired in March of 2006. The piece was rebroadcast repeatedly around Germany, and a transcript of it is still available online. It captured very well the resistance of the ITS director, the desire of a survivor that was interviewed to know about the fate of his relatives, the anger of the leadership of the Jewish community in Germany at being kept away from the records of the Jewish community in Germany, and a blunt reminder on my part that it is generally acknowledged that knowingly concealing the documentation of the Holocaust is a form of Holocaust denial. Official government notes critical of me and a few published articles critical of me and of my museum followed. But the most significant response was more positive. One by one, the countries on the International Commission gave their support to a final push to open the archives. The last obstruction was removed following some powerfully worded editorials that were published in the New York Times, the International Herald Tribune, and the Washington Post that urged the countries that were still opposed to recognize the moral, humanitarian, and historical imperatives surrounding the issue. Still, there was little evident change of view in Berlin, and Berlin was key, both because of Germany's special sensitivity on Holocaust issues and because of the deference to that special sensitivity that existed among the other members of the International Commission. In an animated discussion with a senior member of the German embassy in Washington, my good friend at the embassy, and he truly is a good and wonderful friend even today, criticized me on behalf of many people, he said, for using the term Holocaust denial. in the recent German television report and in the New York Times. I responded to my friend, and I'll say again, he is a deep and close friend still today, in the following way. Germany should have no doubt, I said. Opening the ITS archive must happen and is going to happen. This train is moving down the track faster and faster. The only question I have is whether Germany is going to be on the train or on the track. I expressed the hope that Germany would join in making the opening a reality. I pleaded with him for German Foreign Ministry support and offered to share any credit that might follow, which I believed would follow, with Germany, and even to give the entire credit to Germany. Finally, as chancellorships changed in Germany, Germany's ITS policy changed. This was thanks to the direct involvement of Germany's Minister of Justice, Brigitte Zypries, herself from the state of Hessen, where ITS is located. Minister Zypries visited the museum and was open to hearing the case. Once convinced, she was able, as Justice Minister, to clear away the legal obstacles that had been raised earlier by Germany itself, and was able to argue successfully for the opening of the archives with her colleagues in the new cabinet of Chancellor Angela Merkel, in an act that was surely calculated to punctuate the German policy change. Minister Zypries came to Washington to announce Germany's support for opening the archives at ITS at a news conference at our museum. That was on April 18, 2006. A month later, the International Commission of ITS met again in Luxembourg. And at the end of 2 days, agreements were initialed that, once ratified, would at long last open these archives. Now, some people have asked me if I saw this as a victory. In a way, I suppose, but it's really not a victory to be celebrated with cheers or toasts. It was too late for many survivors who had already passed away without the answers that ITS held for them. Remember, it had taken 8 years to get the International Commission's promise made in 1998 committed to paper. If I add that following that meeting in 2006, it took an additional 18 months for the Commission countries and the Red Cross to formally ratify those agreements, and that the ratification process also required constant pressure, mobilization of members of Congress to pressure their parliamentary colleagues, counterparts abroad. You can understand why I can say only, well, of a sort, and way too late, and after too much effort. Now, what was this fight all about? What's in the archive? Let me address these questions quickly and then show you some documents. There are 6 major categories of historical documentation at ITS. Category 1, and you see a brief outline here, consists of about 13.5 million concentration camp documents, transport and deportation lists, Gestapo arrest records, and prison records. You can see entries here for the main camps from which Arolsen holds records. But under these main camps, there are many various kinds of records, and the records of hundreds of sub-camps. The second category of information includes about 8.5 million pages of forced and slave labor documentation, revealing thousands of government, military, corporate, and other users of forced labor, revealing how the system actually worked on the ground, and the consequences, so this is the forced labor document section, and the consequences of treating human beings merely as economic assets to be used up and discarded. Category 3, the so-called post-war documents, contain over 3.5 million original displaced persons identification cards and over 450,000 displaced persons case files. Those are files of whole families. From camps and occupation zones in Germany and Austria, from Italy, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. And also resettlement and emigration records on many thousands of DPs and their families. The total document count in this section 3 is estimated at 14.5 million pages, but it's difficult to know for sure right now because 3/4 of the files have not been opened since the day the displaced person's family's case was closed. Category 4 is the so-called Central Name Index. Now, this is an important tool that provides indications that are sometimes quite specific, but often not very clear at all, of where victim names appear in the massive ITS documentation. If you remember that first card that I showed with Simon Wiesenthal's name, that was a card from this name index, but also in this index, and it's 40 million cards, there are original cards from camps and labor sites that are mixed in. So it's a mix of cards created after the war, cards from the camps, and so on. 40 million cards. Category 5, labeled here non-personal documents, although there are plenty of names there, contained collections that didn't fit neatly into the first categories. Gestapo order files, cemetery records for deceased prisoners and forced laborers, analytical studies of various kinds. And just to link it to the United States a bit, testimonies taken by American soldiers from concentration camp prisoners who were asked immediately on their liberation to describe what happened in the camp and who the perpetrators had been. That small section, non-personal, contains about 1 million pages. It's a small collection. One other category that isn't shown on this schematic includes over 2.5 million post-war inquiry files and correspondence files. These are also extremely rich sources of both historical and genealogical and family information. Now, at the level of the individual, ITS's archives can be absolutely astonishing. I'm sure you remember Mickey Schwartz, Mr. Lucky, from that 60 Minutes piece. There are about 40 documents that relate to Mr. Schwartz at ITS, and I'll show you just a few of them, because they tell you, in fact, how this boy, now a man, then a boy, survived. So here is Mickey Schwartz's official camp registration card, prisoner card from Buchenwald. And all you see, Buchenwald, he's identified as Hungarian Jew, his prisoner number, this upside down triangle is Jew, U is Hungarian, where he was born, so born in 1930. In this town, Makoshamoshi, he was living in this town. Religion, Jewish. Citizenship, Hungarian. His mother, Donia Schwartz. Now, his mother, as you heard, was murdered on arrival in Auschwitz. There's no other card, no other document that records her name. This is it. This is her memorial. And you can see here that Mickey Schwartz has been sent to Auschwitz. He was arrested and sent to Auschwitz. And on May 24th, 1944, he was moved to Buchenwald. It's a pretty interesting card. This is the card on which that other neat one was prepared. And there's additional information here. You can see, of course, his prisoner number. He's a schoolboy. Some of the information is the same, but there's additional information. The last residence of the prisoner, well, they say concentration camp in Bergsass. It's actually the ghetto in Beregovo, or in Bergsass, in Subcarpathian Ruthenia. And you can see that he was arrested, or sent to the ghetto is the actuality, on April 16, 1944. Here's his signature that he mentioned. So as a 14-year-old boy, he's forced to sign for the accuracy of this. And you see that indeed on May the 24th of 44, he is sent on to Buchenwald. Now, it's pretty amazing. In the 5 weeks between the 16th of April and the 24th of May, this 13-year-old boy has been arrested with his mother, taken from their home to the ghetto in Bergsass, or Berigovo, transported to Auschwitz, and transported again to Buchenwald. 13 years old. I'll just skip that one because I know it's hard to read. Here's the list that he was shown in that 60 Minutes piece. And you can see him here, Nicholas Schwartz, his name is crossed out. I'd ask you to look, if you can read the names here, and make it, I don't know if it's legible or not, I'll read some of them. Klein, Markovitz, Leibovich, Bosch, Kachan, Katz, Spiegel, all Jewish names. And the other thing I'd ask you to take a look at is the dates of birth of these Jews. These are all Jewish children. If you look, I think the oldest child here is born in 1928. So this is a list from 1944. The oldest person here is 16. Many of them, like Mickey Schwartz, are 12, 13 years old. And what's the date? The date is the 29th of May, 1944. That's the day that the children on this list, Hungarian Jewish children, you can see here, Hungarian Jews, were supposed to be transported from Buchenwald to Dora. Why is Mickey Schwartz's name crossed out? You would think we could never know, but in fact we do know. This is Mickey Schwartz's Revierkarte, his infirmary card from Buchenwald. All the signs the same. And on the back of the card, you can see that on the 28th of May, 1944, he was sent to the infirmary. A throat infection, respiratory infection. And he was there for 2.5 weeks. He couldn't be sent, he wasn't transportfähig, if I can say it this way. He couldn't be sent with those other children from Buchenwald to Dora because he was in the infirmary. And they didn't want to send a sick child with other children because what happens when you do that? All become ill. What are they doing with these children at Dora? Well, you know the story of Dora, I suppose. It's an underground tunnel complex where missiles and other special weapons that Hitler thought might win the war are being built. And at this period of time in the broader history, there's a massive recruitment of child labor to be sent to Dora to build those missiles and other weapons. Why? They didn't have transistors. They were looking for people with small hands to do special wiring for the weapons. They were looking for people who could work in the very closed spaces that those tunnels were. Small people, small hands. And you can track in ITS, in other records, this massive recruitment of children and sending of children to Dora. Mickey Schwartz doesn't go on this date because he's sick. So indeed, he remains assigned to a block. Here's an appel list from his block. And you can see all the numbers, but down here, 55019, that's Mickey Schwartz. KB, he's in the Krankenbau. So the records absolutely fit together. Now here just we're at the date of May 31st. So those other children are already in Dora. He is in the infirmary. He's assigned to these blocks, to one of the blocks, to 55. And he's still in Buchenwald. Now we're a few months later, November of 1944. And I don't know if you can read this. It says the following children are going to be trained as apprentices. They're going to be taught a skill. What was the skill? The skill was wiring. They were still on their way to Dora. And you can see Mickey Schwartz, 55019. It's difficult to read his name, so he is there. And if you look at the others, they still have Hungarian Jewish children that are being sent. Markovits, Kleinberger, Yakovich, Fogel, and so on. So he's still heading for Dora. This is from another building. December 7th, 1944. Here he is. He's having his tonsils removed. The doctor is identified. 2 prisoner assistants also identified. He remembers this. He remembers having his tonsils removed, but he didn't quite know the full story. In any event, in December, he was still in Buchenwald because he still had health issues, or so it seemed. When he came out of the infirmary, he again is put into a labor group. Now, you cannot, I think because of the unclarity of the document, he is right here. You see 55019. And I just ask you to note that after his number, there's a slash and an 8. The 8 and the numbers after the slashes are the barracks, the block that the person is in. Just retain that 8 for a minute. Let me read you the other people on this list, and you tell me if there's something different about it from what we've seen before. Dampierre, Poirot, Damishchuk, Karpov, Utkin, Vasilenko, Zarnachuk, Omilyansky. Anything different? They're not Jewish names. French names, Ukrainian names, Russian names. So at this point in time, and we know it from other records, this point in time, and we're in March of 1945, there are no more Hungarian Jewish children. He is still alive. He's on this list. No other Jews on this list. We know what happened to the others. Now, for a long time, as I told this story and thought about this story, I wondered what it was that kept Mickey Schwartz alive after his tonsillectomy. Why wasn't he sent to Dora? He called himself Mr. Lucky, but that just seemed very unlikely to me. Remember, this was Buchenwald in the last few months of the war, and prisoners were dying in massive numbers inside the camp and in the labor brigades sent out of the camp. Then a few months ago, a speaker came to our museum and told the story of a coordinated effort in the early months of 1945 by a group of German communist prisoners in Buchenwald to save the last groups of Jewish children who were still being brought to the camp. That group of communists had worked their way into the camp administration. After all, they could understand German-style bureaucracy, certainly better than the Friches or the Kozlovskis or the other people on that last list that we saw. And lo and behold, among the materials that the speaker brought to the museums were photographs that showed Mickey Schwartz among that last small group of children. Almost no children who had arrived in Buchenwald as early as Schwartz survived long enough to benefit from this last-minute rescue effort, but Schwartz had survived. And he owes the fact that he stayed in the camp during the last months of the war to the effort of those German communist prisoners. Most of the newly arrived children were assigned by the communist group working in the camp administration to barracks number 66. And here you see a photo of some of those children from barracks number 66 at Liberation. Mickey wasn't assigned there. He had been in the camp for too long. But he had survived. And here's your reference to Barrack 8, where you can see that at least 43, well, there are 328 youths altogether, at least 43 were Jewish kids placed in that barracks by that group of rescuers and kept in one place so that they could be cared for. You saw the 8 on one of those lists. You remember I told you to remember. So Mickey Schwartz survived. Also in this group, by the way, is Elie Wiesel. He's right here. Rabbi Lau, the former chief rabbi of Israel, also in this group. I can't quite pick out the picture, but he's there. Okay, Mickey Schwartz is in Buchenwald when the camp is liberated. And here you see him appearing before a panel of Allied officers who are determining who in the camp is to be liberated, who's to be investigated, and who's to be sent to jail for trial. Now, the document itself is a little amusing. This is, what is the reason that you were arrested? I'm a Jew. Schoolboy. Here he says, he records the camps that he was in. He's asked, what work did you do? And he tells the truth. Helping and light work. He was fortunate. This is the back of the form, and it's just to show you that the verdict is he's to be released. And he signs his name again. Remember, he's just 14 years old. He's just turned 14. And this is his liberation document. You sometimes hear Holocaust survivors say the Holocaust didn't end for them when the war ended. Even Allied records continued to use the prisoner number assigned by the Nazis. This is his document of liberation, and here he is, 55019. So these millions of pages open up a window on the daily fate of millions of people. There are 17.5 million stories like this in the ITS archives. Mickey Schwartz had never seen any of these documents and didn't know the full flavor of the story that surrounded him. He was a child. Long described as just lists of names, we now actually have a list of collections from the Bad Arolsen archive that is over 21,000 entries. And we know that even that isn't complete. Some of the document collections are huge. Just as an example, 110,440 prisoner registration documents from the main card file of the Ravensbrück Women's Camp, or 101,063 Gestapo arrest records from the city of Koblenz alone. Other collections are tiny, like the 2 lists just a few pages long that you saw in the video, sent to ITS after the war by a former Jewish prisoner at Brunlitz, one of Oskar Schindler's Jews. That prisoner was forced to record the arrival first of the 700 men and then of the 300 women that Schindler saved during the Holocaust. In his letter in the 1950s, the former prisoner first pointed out his own name on the list because he was a prisoner too. And he explained that he kept a copy of the lists despite the risk because he knew that losing track of someone on the list would mean his death. The risk of keeping the list, he thought, was less than the risk of not keeping it. Now, non-Jewish survivors of Nazi brutality. I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit here. Also have their stories told in these records. Someone like this man, Ilya Adjanov, a Soviet Kalmuk, who was a skilled construction engineer with a Russian wife and 5 children. Adjanov's fate, now Adjanov was a trained engineer. He was taken as a forced laborer to build bridges for the German military during the war. His fate was sealed by his face and by his race, which, as you can see here, was judged. I just go to a document which is a summary of the Allied officers' evaluation of this family's needs. So this is the document, and if I'm lucky, I'll pop up the piece of text I'm looking for. Okay, so here is the Allied officer saying a further difficulty is that Ilya, being a Kalmuk of Mongolian race, is ineligible for most Anglo-Saxon countries. You know, racial discrimination did not end with the fall of the Nazi regime and was not the exclusive domain of the Germans. Files also contain the stories of perpetrators of various nationalities who abused the displaced persons system to gain DP status and thus escape Europe and potential prosecution for their crimes. How did some of the most objectionable perpetrators of the Holocaust come to my country? Part of the answer lies in the records at ITS. So here's the man to whom I referred earlier, the man whose case I worked on at the same time Simon Wiesenthal was pursuing him. This is a picture of Viorel Trifa, who unleashed the Iron Guard pogrom of Bucharest in January 1941. Trifa spent the war years in Germany under the protection of the SS. After the war, with support from the Catholic Church, here is his letter asking for the necessary documents for DP status and to leave Europe. You can see he's writing from his place of refuge with Padre Barbieri. So with support from the Catholic Church, he presented himself to Allied authorities as a concentration camp prisoner. He gained DP status and came to the United States. He rose to be the Romanian Orthodox Archbishop of the United States. To look at those records, had this archive been accessible, Demjanjuk's post-war fate might have been different. He was granted the privilege of coming to America, and the United States is still wrestling with his case today. The post-war records at ITS show in dramatic fashion how Allied authorities dealt with the post-genocidal situation they inherited with victory. Both the successes and the failures of policy in unprecedented circumstances. In a world still plagued by genocide after genocide, there's a lot we can learn from that part of these records. I want to provide some time for questions. Let me just draw a few quick, broad conclusions about the significance of this material. Having pressed to open the material, I'm glad to report that it's open. Over 80 million digital copies of these records have already been transferred to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, to Yad Vashem in Israel, and to the Polish Institute of National Remembrance in Warsaw. The material is not well organized. It is not Googleable, unfortunately, and I could explain at great length why. So there are a lot of challenges involved with making the material really accessible. Nonetheless, that's something that we have to do. What's the significance of the story in general? I see it at quite a few levels. First, there's a moral issue here. We have a moral obligation to the survivor generation to respond to their concerns and to provide individual and family information to them. Opening this archive makes that more possible. Secondly, the memorial significance of this, of a collection that identifies at least 17.5 million people and their fates, doesn't require any more explanation from me. The scholarly significance of the material is huge. If I had more time, if this was a scholarly audience, I would talk more about that, but it's absolutely phenomenal. Fourth, in the face of rising Holocaust denial, which we are seeing today, the tens of millions of pages of authentic evidence in the ITS collections will serve as a potent weapon against future deniers, trivializers, and relativizers, especially when we no longer have survivors among us to serve as eloquent witnesses to what happened. Fifth, the struggle to open ITS itself, in the face of the obvious moral, memorial, and scholarly significance of the collections, has meaning of its own. It serves as a reminder, it should serve as a reminder and a warning to all of us of the ability even of good governments and good organizations to not pay sufficient attention to the concerns and interests and needs of people who are deemed to have no power, and who, after all, could appear to have less power and influence than the displaced survivors of genocide. Sixth, these archives remind us of the monumental and long-lasting consequences of failing to act to stop genocide. We live in a world of genocide. ITS has contemporary relevance of critical importance. And finally, these archives send a powerful message and a strong warning about the dangers of resurgent anti-Semitism. And those dangers are all around us. The Nazi regime, Nazi Germany's allies, collaborators, and bystanders, set out to target Jews, or were happy enough to see Jews targeted. But once ethnic and religious hatred was unleashed by enshrining anti-Semitism as policy, the suffering wasn't limited to Jews. Over half of the documents in the ITS archives deal with non-Jews. ITS, therefore, makes one thing very, very clear. While anti-Semitism is definitely bad for Jews, it's also extremely dangerous for non-Jews. That's a lesson the world has a particular need to understand today. I'm extremely grateful for the opportunity to speak here this evening. I want to thank you for your patience and for your attention, and I'll be happy to respond to any questions that you have. Thank you very much.
It might be hard to catch up with questions immediately after this talk. I would nevertheless like to open the floor to questions now. And please feel free if you want to ask your questions in German, and I'll try to translate if necessary. Mrs. Datum.
I have a personal question. After, I think it was in the 50s, when my mother, when we didn't hear anything about my father, who was originally deported from Hungary to Auschwitz. replied, well, we were hoping that he's alive, but we haven't heard anything for years. So she started to apply for widow's pension in Austria. And the Austrian authorities inquired in Bad Arolsen, and we received an answer that he went through various camps and he perished. He died on the 15th of March, 1945, 3 weeks before the liberation. And when we have received this sad news, I have written to Arolsen and I asked them, could they give any information, the circumstances under which he died. I never received any answer.
You share an experience that, frankly, always made my blood pressure go up. So many people wrote to Arolsen for help and never received any response, or received a response after 10 years or 15 years. Now, what did it mean to have a backlog of 450,000 inquiries? It meant that if you wrote today, you would wait for 450,000 other questions to be answered before your turn came. Today, and this is a result of the opening of the material, it's possible to ask the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum to search these records, and you can do that online if you use the internet, or you can do it by mail. There's a form that you can fill out. It's also possible to ask Arolsen again, and unlike in the past, when they refused to send copies of the documents from which they gathered the information to people who asked, today they will send you copies of the documents. And and our museum would also send you copies of those documents. Their rationale for past behavior, I cannot explain. There was no reason for it, it was just practice. But if they provided you with that much information, it means that there is a document trail that allows them to say that. If you still have that document is going to have on it a case number. And that case number will refer to one of the 2.5 million inquiry files that I referred to, and they would be able to pull that inquiry file and see the document and see references to the documents they used to provide the answer. So today, and this is a difference I just wasn't able to get to in my discussion. Today you would be able to see the documents, and that's part of the big change. Even survivors who in the past might have received an answer never actually saw the documents. Mickey Schwartz would never have seen the document with his mother's name on it, or the document that he himself signed. Today he can see it.
I have a question regarding the political context of today. I would like to know a bit more about what was the reason that they wanted this restricted access to the archive. What was the reason that it was taking so long? Was it intentional or just by case?
So, I of course can only tell you an opinion. I can't tell you what was really behind every action. So let me give you some, the umbrella reason is that no one thought the need of Holocaust survivors or the need of former forced laborers who were not Holocaust survivors to know what happened to their families was important enough to work on. That's, at the bottom line, that's the reason. Now, each country, during the political debate about this, had specific reasons as well. If you remember, I'll start with the United States, okay? Because I feel best able to speak about problems in my own country. I hope there are people thinking about this in those other countries. In the United States, we were not willing for a very long time to pick another fight with one of our closest friends, still one of our closest friends, obviously so, the Federal Republic of Germany. Germany did not want this material open. Why not? If you remember, in the Schroeder administration in Germany, there was this notion of Schlussstrich about the Holocaust. We're going to say this is past history and move on. You don't draw a line under something and move on by putting 50 million new documents into the public domain. In Italy, I cited several countries that were more reluctant than others. In Italy, the Italian government in the 1980s placed in Arolsen all of the records of the Italian displaced persons camps. Now we know that it was through those camps and through Italy that hundreds of really terrible perpetrators and murderers escaped Europe. Frankly, I believe, now here it's my belief, that the Italian government put the documents there because they thought no one would ever see them. So if someone then comes and says, let's open this, that could not possibly be acceptable. Some countries paid special attention to the sensitivity of Germany. Some countries were concerned about the amount of collaboration that was revealed from their own countries in these records. In each place, the reason was somewhat different, but the overriding reason was that the voice of survivors was not being heard. And there, I mean, more significant than the opening of the archives, even for me personally, is the ability to speak with the survivors that I know and have them say, you did something for us. I mean, at a personal level, that's very deep and very significant for me.
There's the lady in the back. Could you wait for the microphone, please? I'm sorry.
You mentioned not only Italy, but also Belgium. Could you imagine what did they have an interest in not opening?
So I can imagine it, but I can't tell you for sure that this was the case. I could only, because I don't have their head, I only have my head. As I watched the Belgian policy evolve, it was hidden behind many obstacles. The federal nature of the state, the fact that every region had to vote on a change. These agreements that I'm talking about are actually international treaties. So for Belgium to agree to change a treaty requires the agreement of each separate district in the country. Now, as a historian, my analysis was a little different. There are two language communities, let's say, in Belgium. One, history would say, with a higher level of collaboration in history and with Nazi Germany, and one with less collaboration. And there is already friction between those two communities. Do you want to add another issue around which there can be friction? So politically, I could understand that this was a very, very difficult issue for them. Not surprisingly, in the case of Belgium, as in some other countries, it took having the right person appear at the right moment for national policy to change. Someone had to be willing to make the case. I spoke about Brigitte Zypras, the German justice minister. An absolutely key role. She was a person who appeared at a key moment and was willing to hear the argument made.
I have a question regarding finding aids. There's a huge amount of files and so on. Are there any plans to make a database at the US HMM or at Yad Vashem or what else? Because as soon as there are no finding aids or databases, it would be not very easy for any researcher.
It's a great question. I'm glad that you didn't ask where are the finding aids, because no finding aids were ever prepared for this material. The archive, it's at least 50 million pages, was disorganized systematically. It was disorganized. In other words, original collections of documentation were dismantled and placed in not logical places or order in order to do one job, which was the job that ITS felt it had, which was to find a name of someone in this mass of documents. Now, they didn't do that very well, but it is possible to find names sometimes, if you have luck, knowledge of the history, knowledge of the patterns, and so on. But from a scholar's or a research perspective, realize there was never an archivist in this place. A trained archivist got hired for the first time for this archive 2 months ago. There was never a trained historian on the staff. So someone who could see the logical connections of collections wasn't there. But to answer your question in the shortest way maybe, yes, we are working together with Yad Vashem and together with ITS. And I'm hoping that perhaps some other countries on that commission that will receive copies of the documentation will have an interest to create finding aids. We're doing two things. Some general cataloging from the top down. Recognize that if you go to our museum's website and look at the inventory of those 21,000 plus collections, you'll see that often one sentence describes 50,000 documents. This obviously is not a useful inventory. It just provides a little bit of a guidepost. If there are 100 collections that relate to Dachau, well, you might, and you're working on Dachau, you might look there. If there are no collections, or there's one collection that deals with Ravaruska camp in Ukraine, well, if Ravaruska is your project, this is not where you're going to find your material. But we are working on finding aids, and we'll do some general cataloging from the top down. And for some parts of this that have been organized, or I would say disorganized, totally alphabetically by name, our plan right now is to do some data extraction that at least will allow people to differentiate among names, so that you can get the names of Jewish prisoners in a certain camp, or people, Jewish or non-Jewish, who first registered as DPs in a certain place, or who came from a certain place, so that people can begin to do research in the documentation. Right now, it's a huge challenge to undertake any scholarly research project.
Lothar.
Maybe I want to follow up on the question of scholars research project. How is the situation actually? You just mentioned before the systematic or very condensed strategy of even avoiding that scholars would apply to get access to the material. So how's the situation nowadays? Is it possible for researchers and academics to go directly to Bad Arolsen and to get access to the material?
The answer is yes. There's a reading room. For some parts of this documentation, the staff would be able to take you to a collection of records. So for instance, if you wanted to see a name card file from a particular place, that's probably all in one place. But if you wanted to use the labor material, or the displaced persons material or the inquiry material, you can go and you can ask, if you know specific names, there's a tool that might help you find the name. Recognize the only names they recorded were names of victims or people who passed themselves off as victims, like Trifa and Demjanjuk. These records are also full of the names and actions of perpetrators. There's no systematic record of that. But can you go and try? Yes, you can. Similarly, at our museum in the digital copies that we have already, similarly at Yad Vashem. It really depends on the project. For certain kinds of projects already, if the project relates to the concentration camp structure itself, there's reasonably good access even now. These are the documents that the staff there used most often, and therefore they semi-organize them. If it relates to the other parts, it's very, very difficult.
Are there other questions? Sabine.
I have another question. Are there any attempts to get access to the files of the Red Cross, for example, in Switzerland or so? Or is there any cooperation with the Red Cross also regarding files about perpetrators?
It's a great question, and it's great for me because it allows me to tell an interesting story. The Red Cross archives from the Holocaust period are open. You can go to Geneva and use them. We have copies of all of them on microfilm in Washington. You can come to Washington and use them. Now, why am I smiling about what's the great story? The same person who made it possible for the archives of the Red Cross to be open played a very dramatic and very resistant role, still working for the Red Cross, in terms of keeping the archives of Bad Arolsen closed. So on the one hand, we had a positive experience with someone who was way ahead of his institution. On the other hand, when I said again and again, the director of ITS and the Red Cross, my reference was to a specific person who represented the Red Cross in all of this for a long time, who was absolutely impossible to move on the issue. But the Red Cross files are open, and they're quite interesting, actually. Including the reports of Red Cross missions that went into some of the camps, that went to Transnistria, that went to Terezin. Those you can all see.
Marianne Inigl.
Could you please give us an idea how far this policy of keeping everything secret helped the perpetrators to go on?
I think I made my opinion clear by telling the Trifa story and the Demjanjuk story, and there are many more there. I made reference to that documentary that was done in Germany on Das Erste. There was an interesting little piece of that in which the interviewer asked the director of ITS, so are there any names of perpetrators in this documentation? No. Keine Täter, keine Täter, he said 100 times, keine Täter. The interviewer then said, well, can I see some of the documentation? And he said, oh, sure. And he took him into the camp's card room that was in this video that you saw. And he pulled a file. And the first document in the file, I've forgotten from which camp, was today I ordered the following 15 Jews executed, names of the Jews. My order was carried out, signature. And the interviewer said to him, and this is on television, it says to him, well, do you think this is a perpetrator? And the director said, well, it all depends on your point of view. Now, what did that mean? And for me, it was a revealing moment. If you define the job of ITS to know about the victims, it's not your perspective to see the perpetrators. You can say, I know that I can show you the name of every victim who's in our files. But in the central name index, there's not one name of a perpetrator, even though those names are in the files. You can't separate the perpetrators and the victims. So those names are there in large numbers. Do I think that any government resisted opening this for that purpose? You know, sometimes I can be a cynical person. On that issue, you know, two things were said during this campaign. One was people are hiding the perpetrators, and one was governments don't want this open because it will lead to more claims for compensation. And usually those remarks were directed at Germany. I don't think there's a country that has done as much to deal seriously with its history in the Holocaust in terms of education, compensation, pursuit of war criminals, as Germany has, and the number of trials shows it. So for me, it's very difficult to think that that was the case at national policy level. Do I think that there were people in the administration who might have been thinking these things? Yes, I do. Do I think that was Germany's national policy? I don't.
Yeah, as it's already 8:30, I'd, if possible, like to close with one question by myself.
This will be a good one.
No, it's just from a personal perspective, as I've been working for the Holocaust Victims Information Support Center of the Jewish Community, Vienna, dealing both with archival material and with lots of requests by survivors. From an organizational point of view, in the museum, in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, what did it mean to prepare for all the material to be taken over and for all the requests you had to face?
Yeah, so there are two parts of this. First, it has required and continues to require a considerable investment of money in computer hardware, the development of software. You know, part of the reason that there was such a backlog at ITS was that they didn't think it was very important to do the work. Part of the reason was their systems didn't allow them to do the work, even if there was someone who wanted to do it. So there's a lot of technical expense involved in getting the material and working on making it more accessible. In terms of responding to requests from survivors and their families, we've had about 7,500 of those since January. We've trained staff, we've hired additional staff, we've trained staff, we've sent staff to Arolsen to begin to understand what the many notations on documents and on index cards mean. Those index cards were created over a 60-year period by now 3 generations of employees. Not all of them did the work the same way. Not all of them were systematic in indicating that they had found something or hadn't found something. And we basically had to build a staff knowledgeable about all of that in order to respond to inquiry. So there are considerable salary expenses as well. Having said that, right now we're managing to respond to those requests in about 12 weeks. If we have at least a first response, so if we find if we know that there's nothing, people are told. If we find documents, we'll send the first documents that we find with an explanation of what they are, and then follow up as we find more. 12 weeks can seem like a long time to someone who's 80 years old and has waited 60 years to be able to ask the question and get an answer. If you compare it to the 10 years that people waited before the documents were open, well, then it's not such a long time. And I think we try to understand both sides of that. So we're doing it as fast and as well as we can.
Paul, thank you very much, not just for this lecture, but also for all what you did to open up this article.
Thank you. Thank you very much.